Hey, great to see you, Lillian.
Nice
We
to
are
see you,
here
Bridget.
today. It's nice to be here. I'm Bridget Welsh. We're here today as part of the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute conversation series on COVID-19. And we're here today with Lilianne Fan, who is actually a co-founder of the Geutanyoe Foundation, which is based in Malaysia and Indonesia, looking at issues of refugees, vulnerable communities, as well as issues of the Rohingya. And of course, as we all know, that the issue of these communities, and particularly the Rohingya, has been in the news. And we felt it was important to have a conversation with Lillian to sort of see what we needed to know and also what are the issues ahead for this community in COVID-19. Lillian, can you tell us what's going on now with the refugee situation in terms of the Rohingya?
Yes, of course, Bridget. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. I think it's really important for us to get some understanding of the context that we're dealing with when we're talking about the Rohingya community. This is a crisis that has been going on for many decades. I think that's the first thing we need to remember. This is not a new crisis. So we have to understand that historically the Rohingya have been suffering as a stateless community. They've been denied citizenship in their homeland of Myanmar since the 1980s and have been facing denial of basic human rights in their home country and particularly in their home state of Rakhine State, which is on the western side of Myanmar bordering Bangladesh. So this is a community that has really faced a lot of discrimination, persecution, dispossession, and displacement, and very direct and intensive brutal violence for many, many decades. And increasingly, we can see that in the last few years, since 2017, 2018, the last few years, the violence against the Rohingya in Rakhine State has increased and has become more brutal to the point that in 2017 and 2018, there was a large exodus of Rohingya basically crossing the border into Bangladesh, creating a larger regional refugee crisis as well. But I think that we need to remember that Rohingya have been fleeing Myanmar for many decades because of the lack of recognition of their citizenship rights. And therefore, it isn't a new refugee crisis. It's one that's actually been facing the region for many, many decades.
What's new? What's going on now? There are issues that they're going to be sent to an island from Bangladesh. There are issues that there are boats coming. What's happening in the current context that may be different in terms of not necessarily the underlying factors, but kind of the immediate issues that are ahead.
So Bangladesh has been hosting a large number of Rohingya refugees for many decades, but because of the exodus in 2017 and 2018, that number has grown to beyond 1 million people right now. So Bangladesh has really been struggling actually to shelter and sustain this large number of refugees. The international community is supporting them. Bangladesh basically gives access to territory, but a lot of the humanitarian aid that is reaching these communities it's basically from the international community, NGOs, the Red Cross, and UN agencies. But because the numbers are so large, basically Bangladesh has tried to come up with an alternative space, an alternative location for the Rohingya refugees to reside within Bangladesh. And they've proposed basically relocating hundreds of thousands of Rohingya to an island called Bhasan Char, which is off the coast of Chittagong. And there are concerns about that island because, although there is new infrastructure that's been built on the island itself is in a very unsafe area, which is directly in the path of cyclones. In fact, the island itself didn't exist until quite recently because it's basically sediment of, sand that has been accumulating, creating these islands, which also means that it's actually very unstable. So it's in an area where it's very prone to climate change. It's very prone to disasters, and facilities on the island. Although there is a physical, infrastructure that's been built, it's also very deprived of any kind of sustainable livelihoods, resources, and some basic services, would be very inaccessible as well. So the UN has basically asked for a technical assessment to be done, and that hasn't actually happened yet. So the international community is in conversation with Bangladesh about the feasibility of using that island as a relocation site, and that discussion is still ongoing, and there isn't really an agreement, that Bangladesh and the international community have come to on this. Bangladesh is still trying to push for the use of the island, but the international community is hesitant because they really do want to see the technical feasibility of this location first.
You have been to Cox's Bazar, where many of the refugees are located. They've been. Could you describe what's happening there, and why there is such an urgent, pressing need for the international community to take greater action, given the conditions that many of the Rohingya are living in?
Sure, Bridget. I have been to Cox's Bazar many times, especially in the last 2 years, and I have to say that I've been working on refugees for many, many years, and persons in displaced situations, populations affected by conflict. But going to Cox's Bazar, which one of the camps there is now the largest camp in the world, Kutupalong. Going to visit these camps, it's still really a shock, and you see people living in, I would say, just absolutely dismal conditions. These camps are very tightly packed. They're really overcrowded. They're extremely basic. There's really no permanent structure in the camp. Everything, the shelters that people live in are really made of tarpaulin and bamboo, because the Bangladesh government has put restrictions on what kind of material you can use to construct, shelters and other structures there. So it is extremely basic. The international community and even the local Bangladeshi humanitarian organizations have been working really hard to try to ensure that basic humanitarian needs are met. And I do think that, they've succeeded in sort of reaching that basic level of humanitarian assistance, but there's very little beyond that. So, for example, looking at education, food needs are basically met, but there's no access to education that's meaningful in any way. There are informal learning centers that have been set up, but they're really not anything you could call proper education. There's the Bangladesh government recently did agree to allow for Myanmar curriculum to be used in a number of the camps, but at the same time, that's a difficult thing to implement because there aren't very many. You need to hire teachers who are able to teach the Myanmar education. And with the Rohingya who have basically been denied education in Myanmar for so long, it's not really that easy to even find people who are able to teach that particular curriculum. So there are, lots and lots of challenges in these places, just in terms of basic protection, especially for children and women and for the elderly. The situation is really poor in terms of protection. You've got these tightly cramped camps. You have lots of areas that are forested. Just to get to basic sanitation facilities, to get to the community latrine, it's very unsafe. There's very little lighting. There are people who have to make these journeys, basically walk into these facilities in the middle of the night, and it's extremely unsafe. There's a lot of harassment that could go on. I think we need to remember that these are not camps that are tenable for anyone to live in for a sustained period of time. These are really places which where there is a lot of misery still, and people do feel extremely scared, and the Rohingya don't intend to stay there. The Rohingya actually do really want to go back to Myanmar. They have said over and over again, including in dialogues with ASEAN, for example, that they really want to go home. And they have mobilized a campaign, in fact, which is called the Going Home campaign. And it's made very clear that Rohingya don't want to stay in Bangladesh. They want to go back to Myanmar, but they want to go back with the level of, number one, protection, physical protection, guarantees that they won't be subject to violence, and also a level of protection according to basic rights. So they do want to have a citizenship, right to nationality, and access to basic services like healthcare and education.
So when you talk about the need to go back, the intensive fighting that is now taking place in the northern Rakhine, between the military and the AA, the Arakan army, as well as obstacles that have been ongoing for the last decades, as you said, but particularly in the last 2 years, where there haven't been these steps taken to sort of create conditions for people to feel safe and to feel that they have a sense of rights. What do you see as the chances of them being able to go back, and what other alternatives are there, given the fact that the conditions in northern Rakhine State are really quite also untenable for a safe return?
It is really a big challenge, Bridget. We've seen that exactly at the time when there has been conversations about the need to return, the need to enable the repatriation of Rohingya, and there are many countries working on this. From Bangladesh to China's put pressure on both Bangladesh and Myanmar to try to facilitate repatriation, or try to encourage repatriation, rather. ASEAN has also tried to, state the importance of repatriation, and has tried to put in place some initiatives to be able to support that repatriation, including building the capacity of the Myanmar officials to be able to process, returnees. All of these initiatives, unfortunately, haven't gone very far for a couple of reasons. One is, as you mentioned, there's an armed conflict right now in Rakhine State, which is in fact getting worse. It's intensifying, it's really escalating, and that's the conflict between the Buddhist Rakhine through the Arakan Army and that armed movement, which is asking, for autonomy and self-governance, with the Myanmar military, and that's affecting all people in Rakhine. Particularly the Rakhine themselves, but also the Rohingya community, who is now affected by this conflict as well as other minorities. That's the first reason. So physical security is really not there, and in fact is deteriorating rapidly. Number two, there's been very little that's been done on trying to guarantee any type of protection and an extension of further rights for the Rohingya community. So there really has been very little done on the Myanmar side to try to offer the Rohingya some type of guarantee that they can feel is genuine, which would guarantee a right to citizenship. And there's been an offer of this thing called the NVC, the National Verification Card, which has in the past actually proven not to be sufficient for Rohingya, and it still forces Rohingya to identify themselves as basically as immigrants, and doesn't give them the right, the sufficient level of protection and entitlements that they feel is that they should have. So there's been very little progress on this, I think, and I think that that's one of the biggest blocks. That there's really this impasse between what the Rohingya require to be able to return and what Myanmar is willing to give. And until we sort of move on that, as well as move towards a peaceful resolution, or at least stabilization of the situation in Rakhine State, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to think in tangible terms about having repatriation even be possible at this point. So what are the alternatives? I think that's a really difficult question. Certainly for many Rohingya, they don't see an alternative besides trying to flee these awful situations and trying to find refuge in other countries. So this is why we see many Rohingya trying to get onto boats, trying to come to Southeast Asia, where they feel they might have a better chance of survival, they might have better protection. Many have come to Malaysia, but many have also tried to get to Thailand, and a smaller number to Indonesia as well. But also, I think we shouldn't forget that the traffic of Rohingya and the passage and journeys of Rohingya to try to flee, it's not just towards Southeast Asia. There are many who've gone towards other South Asian countries, towards the Middle East as well. There are countries such as Saudi Arabia is hosting a few 100,000, Pakistan is hosting a few 100,000. There are many, India as well, has quite a large number of Rohingya. So Rohingya are really trying to survive wherever they can. They're trying to get to whichever country they manage to get to and trying to survive. I think we need to be, aware of the fact that for the Rohingya side, it's a struggle to survive. It's a struggle to find a safe place where survival is possible until they can return. Their ultimate intention is to return to Rakhine State, to return to Myanmar, with the recognition of citizenship. But they don't really have much other choice besides trying to get to whatever country is safe for them.
What's the situation like in your assessment in Malaysia for Rohingya? And we've seen this issue come into the news with very serious issues in recent weeks. What's your assessment?
So, for Malaysia, I think, again, we need to look historically at basically the way Malaysia's approached this, the situation of the Rohingya community for over many years. Malaysia's actually been quite welcoming, not officially, granting any type of official status or legal status to Rohingya, but at the same time, at certain times allowing for Rohingya who are here or who manage to get here to stay. They realize that they can't deport Rohingya. So, the Malaysian government has been trying to look at ways of extending a small number of, limited rights to the Rohingya, including looking at, they've actually piloted a few work rights projects, which I think has been, is really important. And last year they were talking about trying to expand that work rights pilot project to other sectors and to a larger number of Rohingya refugees as well. And that's because Malaysia understands that, until Rohingya refugees can return, there are going to be many who are here in our society. And it's important to at least try to manage that situation better. Malaysia has also spoken out, in terms of foreign policy positions through our foreign ministers and through our prime ministers at international fora as well as at regional fora. So there have been times when Malaysia's taken a very strong stand and has really spoken out in defense of the Rohingya, calling the violence there genocide or ethnic cleansing, calling for accountability of, perpetrators of this violence, and calling for an attention to the root causes, right? And, really trying to push for regional work on trying to get Myanmar to extend a greater level of rights, including citizenship. So those are issues which Malaysia's taken up over the years. I think that what's been ignored for a long time is the realities on the ground, right? So the fact that, we now have over 100,000 Rohingya refugees living in Malaysia across the country, actually, across the peninsula. From Perlis all the way down to Johor, you'll find Rohingya in every state. And I think that what's important is to try to understand what's been happening at the local levels. I think these campaigns, the xenophobic campaign, on the one hand has been very, there's a lot of fabrication of claims around that. There's been claims that Rohingya are trying to ask for citizenship rights in Malaysia, which is not true. That statements that were allegedly made by Rohingya leaders, in fact, are false. That these are fabricated demands from the Rohingya community. But I think at the same time, there's some issues that have arisen from these discussions that need to be taken very seriously. And those are issues about looking at the way that Rohingya interact with the host community. For examples, in certain areas like, in the wholesale markets, right? So Selayang has become a big issue that's been, has generated a lot of discussion and debate and accusations. And it's not just against Rohingya. In fact, there's a big Myanmar Muslim population here as well, and they're in fact the dominant group in Selayang amongst the migrants and refugees. But the fact is that certain areas like Selayang and like other, wholesale market areas have actually been left pretty unregulated, and I would say even turned into a bit of a ghetto. And I think that we need to take some of these issues seriously because there's very little structured dialogue and constructive dialogue that takes place between the local host community population, as we call them, the host communities, which are the locals, with Rohingya and refugee and other, migrant and refugee populations, asylum-seeking populations. And I think it's important that we find ways of trying to manage these situations precisely because people do need to live side by side until Rohingya can return, which is what they want to do. There will be Rohingya in this country. There will be other refugees in this country until they can return or find another, location to settle to. And I think that we need to take seriously, the Malaysian government and society needs to take seriously the fact that we shouldn't let issues fester. We should be encouraging dialogue. We should be actually giving responsibilities to the refugee communities as well, and making them aware of their obligations towards Malaysian society and to adhere to Malaysian law and policy as well, and to Malaysian culture and customs. And I think the reason that we're in this situation is precisely because we just haven't done that. There's been very little policy on refugees. There's been very little regulation. There's been very little management and dialogue amongst communities at the local levels. And so I think a way forward actually is really trying to look at how we can promote that type of dialogue and policy.
It sounds very sensible, but for ordinary citizens, many of them are concerned about health concerns, and there is these sentiments that, while not as vitriol as the hate speech that we've seen over some of the social media, there have also been these apprehensions about immigrants and about the large number within parts of Malaysian society. And there's of course the experience of Singapore, where immigrants were seen to be to increase the number of cases that came into the country. Are there ways to kind of address some of these concerns? I mean, because it's very difficult to talk about new policies in an environment where a lot of the government actors are focusing on COVID-19. So yeah. COVID-19 at the same time is raising these concerns from a perspective of ordinary citizens. What are the other things that can be done? And what are the sort of, what would you say to ordinary Malaysians who are saying, hey, we don't want these people here, or we're concerned about the health issues? What else could be done in this context?
So for COVID-19, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the concerns about allowing new people into the country, that's number one. And I think, in fact, our government has shown that we have managed that pretty well. You know, we have been very tight on allowing people in. When there was a boat that arrived in Langkawi in early April, and in fact, that boat did disembark. And the first thing the Malaysian authorities did was to deploy the health ministry. The health officials actually went to Langkawi and conducted screening and testing for all of the people who were on the boat. They engaged the Red Crescent and NGOs and UNHCR. Everybody basically worked together to address that situation. So I think that was a good example of, you know, it's not that we want to invite people to come in, but during this time, but at the same time, when people do arrive, and it's a little bit too late to, you know, to stop them from coming in, we have procedures, we have SOPs, and if we follow those SOPs, we can actually manage the situation. That's one thing. I think the second thing is, in terms of people who are already living here, again, we need to kind of look at, you know, there's many different groups that we're talking about here, right? So there's, you know, the Rohingya community themselves as, you know, one of the many refugee communities in this country. There is the larger asylum-seeking and refugee population. There is, you know, many also don't have UNHCR cards, for example. The Myanmar Muslims, most of them don't have UNHCR cards. So that's why we use the term asylum-seeking, because they do seek asylum, but they don't always get it, that recognition from HCR, which means they're still undocumented. Then you've got the broader migrant population, right? The foreign worker population. And that of course, goes into the millions. So I think we've got to be quite specific also about the way we're talking about these groups. If the concern is just about Rohingya, I mean, I think honestly the best policy to take is not to stigmatize and not to, you know, kind of witch hunt certain populations, because in fact we are all in this together. And the government policy, which I think the government actually tried to articulate, particularly early on in the COVID response, is that you know, nobody should be left behind. We're taking an approach that is inclusive. There was a very strong encouragement from the health ministry and even from the National Security Council to try to help prevent fear amongst the undocumented population by assuring there would be no arrest. And I think it's a bit sad now that we see that you know, that early commitment is now being reversed somewhat. And I think that, you know, the more that we sort of take a criminalizing approach to undocumented communities, the more fear there will be. And I think we've seen that, you know, I mean, the recent days, there's been a new cluster that's, you know, emerged amongst foreign workers, not amongst refugees, but amongst foreign workers in the KL area, Jalan Ampang area. And then there was a report today that, you know, there was a number of, well, there was an announcement that, you know, the government wants to test all foreign workers, which is going to be a huge task because there are millions here. And then there was a report today that some foreign workers have basically, you know, tried to go into hiding, right? And have tried to, and I'm not surprised at that. And I think instead of continuously blaming, you know, foreign migrants, foreign workers, refugees, and asylum seekers, we need to think about why people aren't coming forward. When the government did make statements about not arresting people and about the fact that screening and testing and treatment for anybody with symptoms of COVID-19 were going to be free, including for all foreigners, including those who are undocumented. That was a huge encouragement for people to come forward. So even after the Tabligh cluster emerged, for example, there were members of the undocumented communities who had participated in that. And people did start to come forward after the government made an announcement that there would be free testing and free treatment for anybody with symptoms, and that people wouldn't be arrested, so they shouldn't fear coming forward. And that was a huge encouragement. People really did cooperate with the government. People really did come forward. They felt that it was a safe environment. If we start criminalizing people, we're going to send people into hiding. We're going to actually create a much bigger disaster for everybody because we won't be able to track people.
So you're speaking about, trying to have a more holistic approach, a more compassionate approach in terms of engaging this community. What can ordinary people do? I mean, what, in terms of, as opposed to just the government actors, and what can ordinary Malaysians or people living in Malaysia do?
I think the first thing that Malaysians, and any ordinary person can do is to educate themselves about this population and not believe, the fake news and these very rabid hate campaigns that have been circulating, but really try to go to, credible sources for information. So, reach out to sources such as UNHCR, such as NGOs who have been working with these populations for a long time. It's not very difficult to find out who they are. Just go to the UNHCR website and you'll already find some facts, actually, of how many asylum seekers are in the country. Reaching out to organizations who are working with this population. There are many, actually. I mean, not just my organization, but there is many of them who are working with the migrant population as well as the refugee population, right, from ABIM to MAPIM to Asylum Access Malaysia. Some working more on the legal side, some working more on the humanitarian side. There's so many of us. So it's important to, I think, try to check facts. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I think, recognizing that being a refugee is not something anybody chooses, right? So I think we need to recognize, instead of, I think, having this fear created about some kind of faceless, nameless horde of people who are trying to invade the country, let's put ourselves in the shoes of a Rohingya, and trying to understand the context of what Rohingya go through is actually very painful. We just had a webinar, in fact, Bridget, right before this, where there was, people speaking about personal experiences, about working with Rohingya and having Rohingya friends and what that really means. And we had a Rohingya woman who's now been resettled to the US on that call. And, she talked about her experience as a child, getting on the boat from Myanmar, coming over to Malaysia, basically, really totally unprotected and being extremely vulnerable. When you hear stories like that, when you hear what people go through, why they left, the type of violence that people have been facing, you start to have a lot more compassion because you understand that if you were in that situation, you would make the same choices. People understanding why people are coming, I think, is one big important step. The second thing is, I think, treating people with dignity, not being afraid of populations and actually having the compassion and the empathy. So I don't think, it's not just about sympathy. I think really it's empathy, trying to see people as human beings who are not necessarily here to take something away from us, but are here to survive, and also have something potentially to contribute to society. Many already are contributing to society. There are many Rohingya who have, who are now working for NGOs, including in my organization. All the people who are doing the packaging of, food packs, for example, and hygiene kits for us are Rohingya youth, and they're incredible. They don't ask who the packs are for. I mean, they're happy whether the pack is going to the packages are going to Orang Asli or to local B40 or to a Rakhine Buddhist population, a Chin Christian community. They really are happy to be helping anyone. I have Rohingya youth who've gone out to volunteer to support the homeless community in Chowkit, for example, coming and working with some of our partner organizations like Feeding the Needy. I have 2 Rohingya volunteers now who are actually getting training at the Pit Stop Cafe right now. They're all trying to give back, So I think we need to understand that, try to build those opportunities and not close off and judge people so quickly. I think that would be one of the first things and the most effective things that we can do as Malaysians.
Lillian, thank you very much for sharing your time and your wisdom. All the best with all your important work, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Bridget.